It was my favorite film. We spent a great deal of time in Laguna Beach at a time when there was no one there except a few artists. And it was just literally nothing there. It's hard to believe because now it's built solid. But we stayed in the only hotel that was there in 1923, and it had neither running water or heat or lights. And so it was quite primitive. We worked 6 weeks nearly on a yacht that was hired, and we worked on an offshore. And of course, I love that film because it gave me a chance to, you know, the others were all kind of childish, but they were comedian things. But this was serious, and it wasn't my first feature film, but it was my fourth. But it was the first time that I really felt the weight of the importance of something. I was old enough, I guess, by then. I was 4, and had just really turned 5. And so I worked with Hobart Bosworth and Irene Rich, who were wonderful, great actors. And neither of them had carried over a lot of the dated, archaic gestures and hair tearing, and you know, they were very solid, experienced people. And I always related very well to men, but because I'd worked around men and crew and everything all my life, and worked with my father and the Cowboys. But Hobart Bosworth had a long, interesting career, and he was expressing, he told me things about what he'd done. He ran away from home as a boy and went to sea. And then he took the stage, and then he lost his voice on the stage. And in those days there were no restoration businesses, so he was offered a job in Hollywood because it was silent. And it struck me as such an interesting fact, you know. And I took to him, and we worked so well together. And I liked the part because the little girl had been washed ashore, and he and I worked together as a little girl who helped him all the chores. And because I was a very responsible child and knew that I was the one that was the breadwinner, which people don't believe, but I knew that. And so I loved the fact that this little character was very responsible too. When he overslept and didn't light the light, she grabs the lantern and she goes all the way up the stairs and she saves the day. You know, in those days, child stars, Jackie and I, and say Roddy McDowell later, were heroic children. And that was not always, but it was the ideal model for children. And when I came back many years later as an historian, I had been out of the country, and I noticed that children had become kind of cookie cutter similarity on television. And they were wisecracking with remarks way beyond their years, like Gary Coleman. And then when they outgrew their image, they tried to find another kid that looked just like them and puts them in the slot, you know. So it was a different world, but I did love that film, and it was very successful. I remember Klein quite well, a hands-on man, and of course I was used to people that, working on Poverty Row as I started, there were just, you know, time was money, film was expensive, one take. It wasn't because you were going to be cutesy, it was because they didn't have the money, or they said they didn't.
Could he be a bit of a martinet with the other actors? You know, if things weren't right, could he sort of bog?
No, he wasn't that kind of actor, of director at all. He later worked with W.C. Fields and other people. He was a real, what they used to call a house man, but not under contract. He was a freelancer. Later, I think he got under contract at Paramount, perhaps. But when I worked with him, it was for Saul Lesser. And Lesser had worked through 6 or 7 years with Jackie Coogan. So he knew all the child star angles. And he hired Klein, who had also directed Jackie earlier. So I found Klein very affable. And of course, I had no problem with directors because they didn't pat me on the head and treat me like a child, which when it happened, I felt very insulted because I felt, you know, really on, and I respected my coworkers, and I always expected them to treat me like an adult. I didn't know there were children, other than children than me. My sister is the only other child I ever saw.
So you treated as an equal, basically.
Oh yes, yeah. They didn't pay to cater to me or baby me or anything like that. The interesting thing about that I found was that in the connection with the Peg of the Mountie movie was that only a year and a half before I played in that film, my father had been a ranger in Yosemite. My father had been a cowboy for 12 years, and when the cattle business really went under around 1915, he was a fish out of water. And when he tried to get work at which he was skilled, everything was on wheels. So he tried to adjust, and he, during the war, he worked for the Army, but that wasn't very satisfactory. And so then he went to work for the Park Service. But he was an independent man, and the Park Service was run by military. And the first time a captain asked him to cuff off a horse and shine his boots, my father told him what he could do with both, in very plain English, and he left the service. And so we came to Los Angeles because it was undergoing a post-war building boom. And he got work as a carpenter, which he hated because he was a foot. Cowboys had this fetish for the rest of their lives. They could not work on their feet. It was such a demeaning experience that they would do anything to get away from it. So he came to Hollywood, and by mistake or by accident, he bumped into an old cowboy friend. And they asked the stableman who had the horse that the other cowboy had come with a load of cattle to Hollywood, to Los Angeles, pardon me. And they asked the stableman what there was around because it was Prohibition. And everything had been padlocked. And he said, well, there's an old, quiet saloon up in Hollywood where you can get the real thing under the counter. So they went up there, and it was called a water hole, which was quite appropriate because a lot of saloons were called a water hole. And it was an illicit, secret bar. And there, of course, is where all the cowboys had congregated. And he found out that there was work in Hollywood for cowboys, working in the films. They were Roman generals, they were driving chariots, they were riding horseback and everything. So he joined that world again, and he was working there for about 2 or 3 months when he became a double for Tom Mix. He was a good horseman, a remarkably good rider. But that was so frustrating for these men. They were good riders, but there was no place to go. So eventually 200 of them were reassembled from all parts of the West and worked in film full time. And this was the beginning, 1920. So in April, my mother was she had cabin fever. She hadn't been out of this apartment that she was in Los Angeles, for 3 months, didn't know a soul. And she was squirrely, you know. So the lady next door said, why don't you come with me over to Hollywood? And Mother said, I don't really know much about anywhere, you know. And she said, well, come with me. And Mother said, well, I can't. I have a little girl 5 and a little girl 20 months old. She said, but they're so well behaved. And my father was very strict. He had been a horsebreaker, and he knew that the same skills applied to breaking children. So he was very strict with us. He could snap his fingers and we stopped. And so she took me up with her and my sister. She parked me inside the set, which was a barn. And the other woman had gone up to collect some money that was due her because the studio ran out of money, cash, and the director was going to repay her. So while they were watching a film, the director wandered over to where I was sitting on a stool, and he became fascinated with the fact that I just sat there. That was not 2. And he said, my God, you know, what's the matter with her? And he was looking for a child to work with a dog. And he walked around the stool and looked at me from all angles and tried to get me to talk. I wouldn't talk. I was told to sit on that stool till kingdom come, and I wouldn't move. So then he talked to my mother, asked me to come back, and eventually my father brought me back to the studio, and they put me under 1 week's contract with a dog who was a star. And Brownie had made his own comedies, and he was a remarkable dog, and I was his leading lady. But about 6 months later, he died, and I took the spot, you know, and by that time I was experienced. I worked with him well, we made these films in 5 days. And so on my second birthday, these are all things I've learned from magazines and research. On my second birthday to the day, Julius Stern put me under a contract. Long term is not an appropriate term because I was 20 months old and they knew that child stars were like dogs. They had a very short life. So anyway, I started my career that way. You'd come on the set every morning, made up, sometimes with some inkling as to what you're going to wear as a costume and what the movie's going to be about. But about is a big term. We didn't know, and we had a gag man, and he got $25 a week for thinking up things just one step ahead of the camera. And we'd go out in the street in front of the studio, and there'd be a pause, and the cameraman would say, well, which one do you want to shoot first? He said, well, there's a manhole over here, and we want to take the cover off and have her fall in there. And then there's this, and then we can go to Westlake Park and the canoe chase. And pretty soon it all came together, sort of, And they didn't need titles much, which was an ideal thing because my films pretty much were used in the beginning as chasers. And a chaser meant it was run while the audiences were changing. And a lot of people, as you can imagine if you saw The Big Parade and other films, they were in tears at the end of the movie. And they were just so rattled and emotionally disturbed. This was a new thing, and they got into it. And very often men were dashing away the tears. So immediately they put Baby Peggy in the slot. And then some of them would see Valentino, be imitating him, and they began to laugh. So when they went out happy. Even though there'd been happy endings, before with their other movie. So I was a good cure for embarrassment for people going on the street, facing the real world. But the system stayed almost daily the same. But we did a wide range of subject matter.
Yes.
I did Carmen, the opera, sort of.
Yes.
But I played the 2 male roles and the 2 female roles. And then we did imitations of Mae Murray and Pola Negri. And those things were more unusual for children.
Yes.
The other roles, there were the usual child, bad child, good child, But anything I did was popular. I had a cot, an army cot, in my bedroom, my dressing room. No window, really no closet. And the army cot, I never even did anything but sit on. That was to take naps. But I was so wound up, I not only couldn't sleep, but they never asked me to. So we worked on location. Where was I going to sleep? And but I didn't mind. I enjoyed it. I was very gung-ho. And not only was I obedient, but I had a nature that really liked doing challenges, And I didn't get afraid, but my father, being a stuntman and a horseman, pushed me just as far as he dared with things to be sure that I wasn't cowardly or one of those kids that, And so I never, when I saw children on the set working with me, occasionally, many of them would just have tantrums on the floor until somebody gave them a sweet or ice cream or a soda. And I was outraged, literally outraged. I said to my father, what is the matter with those children?
Well, that's in the side, Dad.
They're not working, they won't work. And I didn't have to have, I had certain routines. At 10 o'clock I had a milkshake for fortification. I didn't have it to shut me up,
Did you look upon your life in the movies as a sort of game at all? Was
No.
it work to you?
It was work.
It was work.
Not that it was the kind of work you complain about.
Yeah.
But there's been amongst parents, not just myself, Mrs. Coogan, Mrs. Temple, and my mother, 3 among many, always gave out to interviewers that, it's so wonderful. A little girl or a little boy, they love to play, and they love to play grown-up. And it's wonderful to think that my little girl has the opportunity to, get paid for, but play all her days. And she said, Peggy doesn't know she's working. You know, she just thinks she's playing. Well, there was a camera, there was a crew. We did some very interesting things that if I'd have known about other children, I would certainly know this wasn't an ordinary day, you know. But it's a fantasy that they want to believe. It's a denial that they're living off their child. And I'm saying that socially, you know. It isn't that I have any particular grudge. But other children, especially boys, when they grow up, they often have terrific rages against their parents. They've been used, they've been thrown away, and I think that male pride is probably stronger and more destructive. And that's why many of them went into alcohol and drugs and suicide. I mean, it's a terribly stressful experience, just devastating to be on the brink of life in adult and be told, like Roddy McDowell was by his boss at 17, you're finished. And Roddy said, but I'm just beginning, I'm only 17. And he said, Roddy, you're dead. I mean, they didn't mince words. No. Roddy told me that himself. And I said, I know. Because when I went to a portrait gallery once to pick up my first studio portrait as an ingenue, and I was just paying for it, and the clerk said, may I ask you a question? I said, sure. And he said, how does it feel to be a has-been at 16? I just left the place. I didn't know what to say. There's a guilt trip. You're made to act as though you did something or didn't do something, you know. And in my case, whether they knew it or not, I was a sole income for my parents. And it was terribly stressful. And I had no identity of my own. So Peggy and I were at odds. You know, I couldn't escape her. And it took years to work through all of this mess.
So really you were on call like 24 hours a day, 7 days a week?
Really, yeah. And of course, keeping my parents glued together as a couple, they were always leaving each other. And this was insecurity, you know. And my sister was very insecure because she had little self-esteem. She was always dismissed as Baby Peggy's sister. That took care of her.
Than you, or?
She was a couple of years older, and she was referred to derogatorily as my baby sister. And everything about her was demeaned. My parents tried to make it up to her, but that was, by then, she was aware of the bigger world. And they came to see me, you know. And every time I went to a party or something, I'd bring her a balloon, I bought her a piece of cake. I knew I was already placating people because she had a rage against me, and I knew it. And we spent our whole lives trying to handle this because it would come up suddenly in the middle of something else. And I just couldn't keep a lid on that for her, and she couldn't keep a lid on it either. Then she'd feel guilty. You know, it just goes back and forth. This was a truism with many child actors who had sisters and brothers too.
You have trouble with their own identities personally.
Terrible, because it just wipes out the identity of the other one. With me, I was dealing with the overwhelming fame of this child so that I couldn't get to the surface and be what I was supposed to be. And I wanted to be a writer from the time I was 8 years old. But I couldn't get anybody to hear me.
Could you make a clear distinction between you as a person and the thing up there on the surface?
Absolutely. And when I was doing the Coogan biography a few years back, I came to the realization almost subconsciously, I suddenly realized, Coogan said later when he was older, if people didn't sort of mob him, fans, and ask for his autograph and, oh, you were so wonderful, he said, I just felt lost, unloved. And that reminded me that when I was a very little girl, when I would be going to sleep, I would be thinking, she's up there, but I'm not her, and I'm me. Yeah. And so, as I said in that book, every one of these child actors has this experience, and they make a choice. Am I going to be that person, or am I going to be the one that goes to sleep every night? And these children were not weird. They were confronted with something that was unusual. And no support from their parents. Their parents, in every case, were so busy keeping them from getting a huge head. Egotistical brats. They didn't give them any money. you know, after my parents had spent all my childhood earnings in film, $2 million, in vaudeville we had a little part of the act that involved a joke about 2 nickels. I've forgotten what it was about. So one time my father sat down with me backstage and he said, from now on, Peggy, you're going to get a nickel for every single show, 3 to 4 shows a day in vaudeville. And this is to teach you to be very careful with money. And I hoarded my money. And so I had $40 in a little purse in Detroit at the Cadillac Hotel, and we had breakfast, and I left the purse downstairs, and it was lost. I caught hell for losing that $40. And that was the only money I got or had ever seen. And the Cougans said to interviewers, Jackie doesn't know anything about money. And he never did. We were never taught to handle. I never even knew what a check was until I was 25. And I was working for my father in a dude ranch as a secretary. And it was too much for him to be taking care of the money too. So he said, now this is what you do with the check. Da-da-da, the date goes here, do this. I never saw money. It came and it went. I bought houses. I paid servants.
Were you aware about personal appearances? Did you have to turn up for certain events, premieres, or?
You're looking at it.
Yeah, so you still
being seen was everything. I mean, as far as duty is concerned, there was a complete discipline, and nobody in those days, even my aunt, who lived in a little town called Decatur, Illinois. And her husband headed a little factory that made house dresses. This was a little mini cottage industry. She, as a pillar of society there, would not walk out the front door with her slippers on. She wore gloves, she had a veil, she had her purse. She left the house as if she were Queen Mary, you know?
Yes.
I mean, there was no question that you didn't any other way. So society in general, middle, upper class society, stressed these factors. But with me, it was the added thing of somebody might stop you and ask for an autograph. You don't want to look like a waif, you know. And so I was very good to work with because I was careful with my makeup. I never touched my face. I never touched my hair from the time I got started in the morning. And my clothes were in such pristine condition after a year when I outgrew them that my cousins had the wardrobe of dreams, you know.
Amazing.
Yeah, I just simply was like that. I still am. It's not because I'm virtuous. It's just that the programming, I took to it. And it's easy for me. I find life much easier laying out what I'm going to wear the next day. We did have dialogue to memorize, even in silence. People don't think that's true, but it is. And so when I came back to Hollywood at the age of 13 to re-enter, and my folks were trying to sell me as an ingenue, so I tried to be as 18-ish as I could be, but I still was too young for the camera, you know. I just couldn't look that old. But I couldn't make it back as a star, but immediately I went to work in bits and parts and extra work. And of course, being on sets in those days, you had this terrific tension. It was like an electric wiring. The air was throbbing. And you'd go on a set, there'd be a director, the kind that Klein was not, but a DeMille or somebody like that. And these people were used to being the lords of the realm. And as soon as the scene was finished, they would say, okay, that was fine, you know. Then there's a little man with a table over here with little knobs on it. And after Mr. DeMille had said that, this little man, Fearless Fosdick, said, Mr. DeMille, we'll have to do the scene again because there was some interference in the sound. Now, the whole crew just was a silence, a moment of terrible silence. The guillotine was in the offing. And they waited. Was he going to blow the whole damn set apart? Or was he going to say, okay, everybody, take your spots again? And this went on very often like that, you know. And the conflict, as I've since read, you know, but I saw it and then I read it later, men like King Vidor.
Yeah.
I met him later, you know, at a festival. And he described that scene where he was on a set, a real room, and the sound man walked through the set. He said, "What are you doing?" And the sound man said, "I'm checking for echoes." He said, "You're going to get them, you know. Every room has them." And he said later in writing that we learned, silent people learned in 2 weeks what had to be done. And we learned all that the sound people knew. They never learned or even listened or wanted to learn from us. They were launched with the feeling that you know it all now and you're in command. And that feeling that the director's giving up command, I look back now, it was a dreadful, terrible thing to do to a male ego. And I never knew a woman director. I mean, there were there, but they never directed me. And so it was terrible. And there were many other things that were bad about silence, but in my case, I was the youngest of full star, you know, who had been thrown into that dead, wounded section. And we were just treated as though we could have walked off the planet and nobody would have missed us. I mean, you're dead. And everything around me, when I started walking to high school in the morning, Hollywood was full of backyards and little bungalow cottages, you know. And in the backyard would be an incinerator, sort of a chimney affair. You burned the burnable stuff there. You never threw cans. Everything was separate. Life was simpler that way. And right beside it would be stacks of tins of films and stacks of stills burned. And that was one of those silent symbolic messages that great actors use to symbolize something. It told me that my life and my career and all of those people that I'd worked with and whole Hollywood that I'd known was burned. It was gone. Mm-hmm. So my self-esteem, I never lost my self-esteem, but I didn't know who the hell I was. You know, and I couldn't be her, and I couldn't get a job, so I had to work extra. And then I found myself working extra with former stars who had been great stars. But you didn't ask anybody what they'd done. That was the indecible question, the unspeakable.
Can you remember some of the stars who
Yes,
were big stars?
I remember Florence Turner, and Florence was a really nice lady, and we worked a lot together. One time we sat in a carriage in the back lot at MGM on a period film, and like all actresses, Florence smoked, you know. And I said, "Florence, could I have a cigarette? Something cool and easy on the throat?" And she said, "Well, I don't know." I said, "Well, believe me, I don't smoke and I don't want to. My father's a chain smoker and so is my sister. But," I said, "if they give me a part and I have to look suave and sophisticated, I'm going to come down in a coughing fit." Oh, she said, "My dear, I understand." So then I said, "You know, Florence, I don't really know much about the early days. My mother always says, you know Florence Turner, you know Vic Motel." I didn't know any of these people. They knew me, but I didn't know them. And I couldn't say, "Oh, I saw you in such and you were wonderful." And that brought up something you didn't dare to do anyway. So with Florence, I knew her so well, I said, "What was it like on an early set?" And she said, "Well, we painted scenery, we did our own costumes, we worked in garages and whatever, barns, and she said, actually, we did a lot of things, but she said none of it was really worthwhile. You know, motion pictures aren't going to last." She said, "It's not really a decent income." And I now know that she was looking back at a career that went sour in her prime.
Mm.
And of course, when I came back to Hollywood at that same time, on the front page would be such and such a famous star commits suicide or overdoses or put her head in an oven, you know.
Yeah.
So I knew about gassing yourself. But as time went on, the same quality of stardom would get smaller and be moved to the back page because so many people died. And I realized that there was a whole real tragedy going on here. They used to run films brutally fast, deliberately, at they weren't festivals, they were, I don't know, events.
Yes.
Any public event that MGM or another studio could grind us through the meat grinder one more time. Baby Peggy's attending. She was a famous star. Now she's working in my movie. I didn't even have a job in the movie, you know. Or Florence Turner is here, and she was very pretty once, but of course she's a wreck now, you know. So, God, and so that was what. And they ran these films, and the whole message behind running these was degradation. Right. And this is what we've done with sound, right. And that all was trash, you know. Right. And until I read that line, I thought that was such a tragedy to me, that everything we'd all done was worth nothing. And the reason I was so ashamed and didn't even tell people I'd ever been in films, I was ashamed to have been a part of this horrible waste of time. As I have often said, there were men on those sets were very aggressive. And other extra men and even the stars would pursue any young woman who was reasonably not a monster to look at, you know. And I was not bad looking. So I discovered the only defense against all these handsy men was to bring a very serious scholarly book to set. And which I did anyway, you know, I was great into that. And I would just read and they would come along and I would just look up and it was like mustard gas. They looked at the book and they just run. And the only other person on the set I ever saw reading a worthwhile book was Lew Ayres. I loved the man. I never got to know him. But every time I'd look up, I think there's somebody else who gives a damn about reading, you know, because the women knitted, the men chased women.
I understand he was a very erudite man.
He was a very erudite man, and I never really got to meet him personally, but I admired him. But there again, I wasn't an autograph collector, no. And I wasn't impressed with profiles. I was very impressed with brains, and seriousness, and dedication, and commitment, and things that mattered, you know. But luckily in life, I met many mentors later, you know, people that were very helpful to me. Nobody even knew who I was. Not that it mattered, but I mean, I never went up there and said, "Hey guys," you know. Yeah. So the only time Baby Peggy ever came up was when some studio found you on the set, and they said, "Get the still man over here." Right. This was Baby Peggy, this was Wesley Berry, this was, you know, and standing next to me is Baby Marie Osborne, who was a stand-in for Ginger Rogers. Really? And Ginger Rogers' mother had written scripts from Baby Marie. Okay. And that's how, and I knew Ginger from vaudeville before she was famous. So those three people, we knew each other.
You never worked with her though, Ginger Rogers?
Yeah, I worked in the movies with her, but I mean I worked on the set, but you know. But she was always, Ginger was very gracious. And her mother had been hired as, of all things, a drama coach. Oh. And Leela was really the ultimate theater mother, stage mother. Yes. Many eventually movie mother.
Many stories about Ginger Rogers' mother.
They were all true. And yeah, I worked with her. I knew her from vaudeville with Gingers, and these are things that children observe very much, you know. Just the byplay between them. And no, Leela was a steel magnolia. Yeah. She was Southern, but she really wasn't. But, you know, I didn't know until later that she was an official studio coach. She volunteered. She was always saying, "Well, you can study with me, Peggy," you know, as though I was an idiot. I'd never seen a stage in my life. An example of the stunt work that is expected of a child was on my first feature film at Universal. And they had a fire scene. The whole tenement in New York burns down. And this little girl is trapped in an apartment alone. And they explained to me, my father and the director, King Baggett, that now you go to this window and it'll be burning, the windowsill. And this window will be burning. And then the door will be there, but it isn't going to be burning. But the audience won't know that because it's on the other side. So you go through the door. And he said, "You have to be sure to do this right, because there's only one take. It'll burn the set down." So I said, "Okay." So we start. I go to the first window where the camera is above the sink in this kitchen. And I check that one out. Go to another window and check that one out. Then I get to the door. And they're burning. You know, what they use is a sawdust and kerosene. And they set fire to it. It's a real fire. but it's a controlled fire, sort of. So I got to the door, and I'm ready to go through, and the doorknob is hot. The whole damn door is on fire on the other side. So they talk to you, you know. The director said, Peggy, keep going, go through the door. And my father said, Peggy, do it. And I thought, well, they don't see what I see. So I'm going back to the first one that wasn't burning so bad. And I just rebelled. I mean, they thought I was rebelling, which was impossible. I turned around and I made it for that one fast as I could, and it wasn't yet too hot. And I'm coming through the window with going all speed, you know, right at the camera, and I gave King Baggage his beautiful shot. And he said, what the hell did you do that for? And I said, look, come with me. And I walked him over to the door, and I opened it and saw it was a cinder, you know. So that's the sort of thing that I learned very early, that they meant well, but they weren't always on top of the situation. It's like falling into a well. They're over there and you're on top of the water, you know. So I learned very early to look after me after I followed orders. I really did, because I had a lot of close calls.